Hi, welcome to our session, Nurturing Collaboration While Weeding Collections, a new interdepartmental workflow. I am Kara Calabrese. I'm the Acquisitions and Access Librarian, and my co-presenters are Kristen Adams, a Science and Engineering Librarian, and Robert Brian Withers, who's the Coordinator of Access Services. We are all from Miami University Libraries. Miami University is a public institution in Oxford, Ohio, with about 20,000 students in total on our main campus. We are an undergraduate-focused institution, as you can see, and we have currently four libraries on our main campus that have about a total of 750,000 items, physical items, held within our collections.
Hi, this is Kristen. Before we get into the details of the project, we're just going to do a quick overview. As mentioned already, our campus has a main library and a couple of satellite or branch locations. And prior to 2020, there were already plans to close the BEST library, which was the Business, Engineering, Science, and Tech branch. But when the campus closed down due to the pandemic in spring and summer of 2020, the library decided that it would be simpler to just not reopen BEST when all of the other libraries in the campuses opened. So as a result of that, we needed to make plans to move all of the collections from the BEST library over to King. And to do that, we were going to need to do a very large weeding project and review all of the collections at both locations so that we could consolidate. And during this time in spring and summer of 2020, most library staff were working from home as it was only essential workers that were allowed on campus. That changed over the course of the project as we got into the fall and then the spring of 2021.
Hi, this is Rob, and we're going to talk just a little bit about our weeding process as it existed before 2020. Prior to 2020, theoretically, we were practicing zero growth in all of our libraries at Miami. However, in our main facility, which served humanities, social sciences, and business, we were blessed with adequate space for growth. When we had opened the Business, Engineering, Science, and Technology Library in 2011, the psychology and business collections were transferred over there, and there was a lot of space. Our space capacity in our main facility at that point was approximately 70%, which is below our goal of 75% or less. And as a result of that, zero growth was kind of sporadic. We were monitoring the number of items purchased. Some selectors were doing a better job of keeping up with it than others, but there was no real pressure because of the availability of space. Over in our new Business, Engineering, Science, and Technology Library, there were some constraints on space. Zero growth was being regularly practiced, and they were at about 76% capacity in the last year of operation. When it became apparent that we were closing that branch library and combining collections with very little available shelving to be added, it became obvious that we needed to look at a new system that involved a regular review being done consistently across all disciplines. And so that's what we've tried to do.
Now that we've had some background on the former weeding practices and this current weeding project's origin, let's talk about workflow. So here's the workflow neatly laid out. It starts with selectors requesting a list from technical services. Technical services then pulls the list information from Sierra based on predetermined criteria. We put that list in folder 1 in our shared Google Drive. And this is where some of the naming conventions and format conventions come in. When we export from Sierra, we use the same export every time so selectors can expect the same information in the same format. And we also would put our information not just in a new spreadsheet every time, because that would get very cluttered, but it would be in the same Google sheet named after the selector. So if Kristen requested a list, I would go to her spreadsheet and then create a new tab and put the new information in that new tab. That was definitely nice for us because I kept everything clean. I knew exactly where it was supposed to go and deposit information. Then the selectors take that, do their review, edit it how they need, add colors, change columns. When they refine it appropriately, then they format it for circulation. So their columns are first. And when that's all finished, they'll put it in the folder 2 in that shared Google Drive again. Then circulation will pick it up and go check Ohio link for how many copies might be floating around the state and add any additional notes they deem appropriate. they'll put it in folder 3, signaling to the selectors that it's time to make final decisions. Then it goes one of two ways. Either selectors take those sheets and that data and go to the shelves and actively pull their own books and put them on carts, or if they feel that this data is appropriately to inform their decisions, or they can't come into the library as a lot of this was done during remote work and many people were not able to come in or allowed, then they could send it to folder 4 and have circulation, who was already in the building, pull that list for them. This generated tons and tons of carts, and they would either do it as withdrawal carts or to be sent to SOAR, which is shared storage facility. Then those carts would go to technical services where we finish the withdrawal process, or we box up the items and send them over to SOAR. And getting more into what is technical services role, really, we really focus on that first part of you request a list so we can start generating information so that selectors can have the appropriate information in order to make leading decisions. So in the beginning, most of those lists would come straight to me and then I would run them, but I realized pretty soon that this would get very overwhelming with the amount of weeding we were going to do. So I created a spreadsheet where I could put in requests and whoever had time could pick them up. So we would put in which collection group it was, which related to which saved query we would be using, who it was for, that would relate to where we would put the list at the end, and what ranges were they looking for. You can see sometimes people requested a lot of ranges at once. Sometimes it was just, let me run this list and then we'll come back for more. And then myself or one of my other 2 colleagues could take the list and note when it was finished. That way it was easy communication between the 3 of us. If something was odd, we would make a note in the notes column. You can see as we move towards more the end, you can start getting more lists without items on it. Now we can go into Sierra and see what running a list looks like. In Sierra, of course, you need to locate an empty list. I tended to start in the 10,000s or the 25,000s, but as a guess of what we might look at, we're going to go search, and we would name our list appropriately. So I'll pick one of Kristen's items, and she had requested a GB list. And if we're weeding in there, that says to anyone else who's using create lists what kind of thing I'm working on. For me, I always need to remind myself to go into the item as the store record type, as I tend to work a lot more with order records in my personal work. And then we can go to retrieve a saved query. Since this is one of the newer saved queries, we can scroll all the way down and we have H weeding and S weeding. Science and social sciences had nearly the same criteria, so we were able to combine them into one query, which is pretty convenient. And you can go in and you can see the query changes up there. We're going to select to see it bigger. So in general, this would be the criteria we'd run for GB, but given that I know Kristen's done a lot of weeding, we would need to refine this up front because this is most likely not going to generate any items. Start with, you need the correct call number range. And there's one of 2 ways to do this. Starts with is if they want all of things within the same letter range, but if they wanted it within a specific, like they wanted GB 100 to GB 300, you would change this to within instead of shared with, starts with. So yes, I'm now talking about criteria. You could refine things. Something else that one of my colleagues noted when she was running lists is that sometimes this is asking too much of Sierra. Sierra tends to work with smaller criteria, so maybe 2 or 3. So you could go with this and limit this criteria ahead of time. I know with this one that there are no more science GBs that meet this criteria, so we might have started looking at items in King instead. Those were things that we could read. So then I could remove the bottom 3 criteria at this point and just try to run it on the first set and see where we come. Now, I already ran this list and I do know that there are items in there. So now that we know that there are items, we can go and run through and run the second half of the query on it. So we're going to start a new search. And we can see this is list 50 is the one that has the appropriate criteria. So again, make sure it's an item. Instead of range, we'll go to review. And then we're going to pull up list 50. So now we're running on the items that are inside that already refined list. That's the first half. So for Ely use, I'm going to go and pull my save query again, so I don't have to type all that information. And just select it. And it's easy to create it. It's one time you have to enter all these items in there, and then you can save as and name it appropriately. So I know that we've already done these first three, so we can just through and delete. So then we're going to refine just based on those 531 items, hopefully to a final list that we could give to Kristen. And then we would let it run. And turns out there are 93 items of which we could give her. So then the next part is we need to export this. For us, this is the same as the shared queries. We also created saved exports. One is because this field delimiter, we've all found that using a comma is not helpful. There are lots of commas present throughout a bibliographic record on a lot of the fields we would want to pull out. So it will mess up the way your text goes to columns. So it's better to use, we tend to use carets. That's what we found has been a better item. So I'm going to go apply saved export. And this also helps us create, again, we talked about that expectations. This creates the same column order and same information within the sheet that we give to selectors, so they know exactly what they're getting every time. And we click the weeding. It takes a while to update, but it would come in, then we would export it and send it off.
Okay, so selectors role. We're going to go into some details of the stages outlined in that flowchart that we showed earlier. And for context, we have about 15 selectors here on the Oxford campus, and they're divided up into 3 collection groups with some overlap. Some people are in multiple groups. We have social sciences, which includes engineering, and humanities. Each of these groups has a coordinator. I'm actually a coordinator for both Soc and for Sci, as science only has 2 other people aside from me. And I'm going to be talking about what the coordinators did and what the selectors did. So first thing was assigning call number ranges to the selectors. The humanities coordinator and myself created a shared spreadsheet for all the LC call number ranges and assigned them to a liaison selector. And some of this was easy and obvious. There were direct correlation to liaison areas like psychology, music, but some of them were in different ways, a little bit more complicated. Education, for example, we have a few education programs and actually 2 librarians who work with those departments. Those are a little tricky to untangle, but getting ahead a little bit to the shared Google Drive and the Google Sheet, it was really good in these situations to have close collaboration between not only the different departments, but also between different liaisons who are maybe looking at the same list together. So another stumbling block when assigning the call number ranges that we encountered were that there were some call numbers like agriculture and civil engineering that we don't have a program for those, so we don't have a liaison librarian for those, but we needed to assign them to somebody so that they would get done. And that was important because those were prime spots to do heavy weeding. If we don't have a program for it, then we don't need to have a substantial collection. And also because there hadn't been a librarian assigned to that for quite a while, there was maybe some old stuff hanging around that we really could get rid of. So again, this call number sheet that we created was a shared sheet in the shared Google Drive so that everybody could stay informed. All right, another step before we started was for efficiency and uniformity, were for the groups, social, science, and humanities, to discuss and agree upon the parameters for the weeding list. We did this separately for each of the groups, and we wanted to set up and establish what should and should not be included on the weeding list. So the ascension date older than 10 years, the number of checkouts in the X number of years, parameters like that. But we also wanted to decide on which fields we wanted on that list. So there's a lot of metadata that you could pull for each item, like renewals or internal uses, but we didn't really need all of them to do our weeding. Doing this up front made it really easy to request a list. So when selectors were ready for one, they would simply email tech services and say, I want a list, say, for the QEs using the Sci parameters, and that was all that you would need to specify. So that made it easy for us, and it also made it easy for tech services to run the lists, especially considering the volume of lists that we'd all be handling throughout this project. So once we'd get our initial lists from tech services, that was usually pretty quick, maybe 2 or 3 days. They would put those into folder 1. The selectors would go into folder 1 in the shared Google Drive and retrieve the lists. Some selectors did a little bit of work at this point, but not really too much because it was hard to tell whether you wanted to keep it or weed it or send it to SORD because you didn't know at this point how many Ohio copies we had. And before we would send it on to circulation to check that for us, then we needed a uniform system for everybody to format the lists the same. So the subject coordinators for each of the groups created a short instruction sheet to add a couple of columns, 2 for selector notes and 2 for circulation. One of those was for the number of copies that were in OhioLink, and we had them format that as a drop-down menu, 1, 2, 3, or 4 plus. and a notes column if there was something weird or unusual that they needed to tell the selector about. Also, everybody clearly had their own style and method for handling these sheets, as you do. But as I said before, handing it off to Circ, in addition to adding in those extra columns, the instruction sheet also included information for what order the columns needed to be in case some people rearranged them, and which columns to hide or display. This way, the circulation staff had what they needed and nothing more displayed for clarity and uniformity. That way, every list looks the same and they wouldn't need to reorient themselves every single time they saw a new list. So once those were ready, then they got put into folder number 2 in the shared Google Drive, and we emailed the circulation supervisor to let them know that there was a new list there. So circulation would then do their thing in OH-IUG and fill in that column for us, and after that was done, then they would put it into folder 3 in the shared Google Drive folder, and they would let the selector know that it was ready for them. So at that point, we had full information to make decisions on whether we wanted to weed, keep, or send the book to Sword. And at this stage, there was also an option between how to proceed. If you wanted to format the list and make your decisions and go to the shelf yourself, then you're kind of done. You didn't need to do any more uniform formatting or anything like that. You could just kind of work on your own. But because this was still between summer 2020 and summer 2021, the selectors at that point had a choice whether they were working at home or in the office. And there were different comfort levels with coming into campus, but also different workloads that they had to balance. So depending on that, there was an option to have circulation staff pull your lists for you. And because they were entirely on campus at this point, and the students really weren't, they didn't have a lot of work to do. So they were quite happy to do those lists for us. And if that was the case, then as before, you would need to make sure the formatting was all standardized so the list would look the same, and make your final decisions on the list, since you weren't going to be going to the shelf yourself and deciding at that point what you were going to send to where. So, and as part of that standardization process, I maybe could have mentioned this earlier, we also established some file naming systems, and it was simply the last name of the selector, the call number range, and the date. So that carried throughout the whole process, and you could kind of keep track of each iteration of the list. So in that last step, then you would update the date and put it into folder number 4, and again, let circulation supervisor know that it was there, and they could carry on with it.
Hi, this is Rob again, and I'm here to talk about the role that circulation staff played in the selection process. Although I am a circulation librarian, I had an idea of the workflow that was involved because my job does include responsibilities for collection management in several areas. As a circulation manager, one of the things that I'm always looking out for is an opportunity to diversify the workflow of my staff. So I'm looking out for projects that can be done during less busy times on the desk, or projects that can be done when staff are away from the desks and out there for 8 hours to stretch. And I saw this as kind of a win-win scenario. There was work that looked appropriate for our circulation staff that needed to be done, and it freed up our selectors and our technical services staff to work that was more central to their roles. So one of the factors that selectors consider in decisions to withdraw or retain items is the number of available copies in our consortium, OH-IUG. Since our circulation staff provide Tier 1 assistance at the circulation desk, they are familiar with using the OH-IUG catalog and interpreting the data there. So they were able to search items that had been identified for deselection or possible deselection, and report back to selectors on how many copies were available in state. It was a good fit for them, and it freed the selectors up from some fairly tedious work and left them more time to actually do the decision making involved in deselection. Something else that needed to be done is pulling the items off the shelves. I should note that there were 2 models for deselecting items. One of the models, some selectors preferred to go directly into the stacks of the cart, and they made their deselection decisions by pulling the item off the shelf and looking at it, and if they wanted to deselect it, they put it on the cart. Other selectors, though, were working from lists that had usage data, so the date the item was acquired, the number of checkouts, internal uses, the last check-in date. And from that, they would generate a list. And For selectors who were working with that model, where circulation was able to help was by stepping in, and instead of sending selectors into the stacks to pull books off the shelf, we were able to send our circulation staff up there, take care of that workflow. Again, it was something that tied into the types of things that we do regularly in circulation. We were able to free up selectors to do more high-level work than pulling books off the shelves. And then we were also able to track statistics as far as the number of items that were being pulled. And my understanding is that between the two libraries, we wound up pulling over 10,000 titles for removal. So again, win-win scenario. It was work that we were happy to take on. It was connected to work that we were doing. It wasn't just something that was randomly added in. And it left selectors free to do more high-level work.
So what is the progress on the project? We fully came back to campus as of June 2021. So selectors now had full access to stacks if they wanted to continue reading, visually going through the stacks and pulling books off rather than just relying on data. BEST is currently a closed stack location. The service point has been removed, and but librarians are allowed to go over if they need to review specific collections, something like maps, maybe oversized books, which were not as easily captured on lists. Also, our reading staff has gone over to process withdrawals from that location as well. Something to note is that we were buying books, we are still sending them and coding them as the BEST location. The thought is that it is better to move the entire range of that call number together rather than having a few books here and there currently on the King shelves and then having to integrate those back into the collection once it's been moved. Most of the selectors are finished with the list that they've processed, but there are some who are still working, trying to refine, trying to pull more, like government documents is also being more heavily weeded as that is potential overflow space for the BEST collection, since the government documents are mostly held in the compact shelving in the basement. And shifting is currently going on in King. If you come to our library, you can see there's a stack of 3 to 6 full ranges that are currently empty. So a lot of great work has been done on this project, and they're now updating signage to match where the new locations are. And to note, there's been about 14,000 items already withdrawn since December. That was about when we started counting. So there might have been more items prior. Our colleagues in Kristen's department are still sending up book trucks of things to be withdrawn, though they are trying to be cognizant of not overwhelming our technical services staff, which we're very thankful for.
All right, as far as new practices to maintain, I believe we've mentioned this already, but the shared Google Drive is definitely something that we would keep for future projects. It was just much easier to have things here than it was to have all these lists and emails. And while there were emails involved, it was just quicker and easier to send somebody an email that there was a list in the drive for them to go and check, or that you had put one there for somebody to go and find. They could stay all organized in the Google Drive. We had a very set file naming convention and folders, folder 1, 2, 3, and 4, as we've already discussed. And because everybody knew where everything was, you could go check yourself what was there, and you could check on this for other people. So this was helpful for the subject coordinators and for some of the people in circulation as well, without having to rely on the email. If you just wanted to go check on see what was in a certain folder, then you could do that without having to bother anybody. It was also beneficial to have it on a Google Drive because then the lists were updated in real time, and so if there was anybody that was working on the same list as somebody else was, either the people looking in the high link searches or some of the selectors also shared some of the lists, and it was much easier to collaborate in that level as well. Another practice that we're going to keep doing is have the collection groups agree ahead of time on what weeding parameters and fields that they want to include. This made it easier both for tech services to run the lists because then they could save the searches and the exports a lot more quickly, and it also saved time for the selectors because not everybody had to decide individually what they wanted. You could do that collectively as a group, and it made it easier to request the list. And then again, as I said, tech services could do it a lot faster as well. So that was win-win. And the last practice that we're going to maintain into the next reading project is having circulation staff check the number of OH-IUG copies for each particular book. That was not something that the selectors particularly enjoyed doing for every single title, but it was something that the circulation staff enjoyed, having another project that was off of the desk. It gave them time away from the public service points, and that was a nice project to do for a little while. to get a little bit of a break. So again, that was also win-win.
And it's Bob again, and this time we'll be talking about some of the practices we tried and opted not to keep. A lot of things worked, a couple of things didn't. One of the ideas we had initially was that when selectors were requesting usage data, instead of having a series of emails flying back and forth to several of us who are able to do those lists, it would be nice to create a Google Doc so that everyone had a central place to go make a request, and then one of us in circulation or tech services could respond to it. And there were some challenges that were unforeseen there. One of them is sometimes the selector would submit criteria and they didn't generate any search results. Other times, maybe selectors would look through the results and realize, hey, I needed to add some additional criteria to that search, or I needed some extra data that I wasn't thinking about when the search ran. And as a result of that, the Google Doc wasn't an ideal venue for communicating back and forth in a quick and timely fashion. And because of that, we wound up again with the emails kind of flying back and forth. So that was one thing that didn't make it. Another thing that sounded like a good idea was having the selectors update a sheet each time they completed work on a range. And there again, it was a little bit of a challenge for people to do that consistently, and turned out not to be as good a way of tracking work as we had envisioned. So those were a few things that didn't work out, but we also had some that did.
Okay, that wraps up our presentation on the large collaborative weeding project that we have undertaken recently. This took a lot of people and a lot of time and a lot of communication to pull off, but we did do it rather successfully. And I just wanted to say thanks to everybody involved and to my co-presenters and everybody listening. We'll see you in the live Q&A, but we also welcome any questions by email.